It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Denise Beck-Clark. Hello, Denise. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Doing fine, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, sure.
So, let's see. Where do you want to start? You've got a book out called 30 Years Hence.
Yes.
And this is your first published novel, according to your bio.
Yes.
What made you decide to publish a book?
Well, first of all, I had written it,
Good reason.
Right, exactly. Actually, I've written a lot of things that have not been published, and I decided that, I'm not getting any younger, and, it's an odd thing to be a writer and to have written many things and to not have them be read by people. So since there is the option these days of self-publishing, I decided to go for it.
Okay. It says here that you've written a blog for a lot of years, yeah?
No, I had a blog some years back.
Oh, you had a blog, okay.
But then I stopped, yeah. Because actually I had a couple of other books published. The first book was published by a traditional publisher. That was called Concurrent Sentences. And the second book I self-published, which was a poetry collection. So when the first book came out, I started a blog, and I had one for a few years, and then it kind of tapered off. But lately I've been writing things for Medium.
Okay.
Are you familiar with Medium?
No, what is that?
Oh, Medium is a website where basically anybody can publish stuff, like essays and articles. People also publish poetry, and from what I understand, a lot of people are reading Medium.
Oh, okay.
And people get followings and all that, so it's another source of getting one's stuff out there.
So is it like YouTube for writing? I mean, where just anybody can put up whatever they want?
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. All right. No, I'll check it out. I haven't, I never heard of it, actually.
You should. There's some good stuff on there, and then there's a lot of, not so good stuff. But I guess that's how it's going to be when, anybody can publish anything, pretty much.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the good news is the same as the bad news. Now anybody can do it, but now anybody can do it.
So, right, exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So what was your blog about? I mean, what did you write?
I was pretty much writing, like essays, basically, things that I was thinking about. A lot of it, I guess, was political commentary on the world around us. In fact, one piece that I wrote years back, which I keep thinking about publishing, I'm not sure if I'm going to, was it was entitled something like, "Why the United States Will Never Have a Demagogue as President." Well, look how that turned out. That was after Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate. And anyway, I don't want to get into politics now or anything, but so that type of stuff.
Okay.
And I've always been interested in politics and also psychological subjects and how those two overlap. And so I wrote a lot of things about both of those.
Okay. Well, you also worked as a psychotherapist?
Yes, and a social worker. I worked for many years in one of the New York State psychiatric state hospitals, And I also had a private psychotherapy practice for many years.
Oh, okay. But you're retired from that now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you a little bit about that, because I've had several people on my show who had either worked as psychotherapists or worked in psychiatric facilities, and it's always been a little bit of a fascinating subject to me. The best horror movies are always done at a psychiatric hospital. And
yeah,
they have changed a lot over the years, because if you go back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, when they were still doing electroshock and lobotomies and insulin shock, all of these horrible things to people. And then in the 80s, the what are they called? Psychotropic?
Psychotropic, right.
Drugs. Came out, and a lot of people got better.
Right.
And a lot of the facilities like that shut down.
Right.
So what are they doing now? I mean, is it... obviously, I don't think they're doing lobotomies and things now, right?
Oh, God, no. Well, now it's still pretty much reliance on medication. I mean, there's also psychotherapy to an extent. I mean, you can't... how should I put it? Most people will say that you cannot treat psychosis with psychotherapy, which ultimately you really can't. However, you can work around it. You can help people learn how to cope with their symptoms. So if a person is, let's say, hearing voices, psychotropic drugs help to an extent, to varying degrees for different people. With some people who have psychotic symptoms, medication can really get rid of them, but with other people, not very much at all. So they can take all kinds of drug cocktails, which do horrendous things to their bodies, and still have the psychosis and the psychiatric symptoms. So, I mean, working with people like that is really it's necessary to help people deal with their situation, no matter what it is. And in these cases, part of their situation often is dealing with psychosis. So that's part of what's going on in the hospitals. They don't keep people as long. I mean, that was a whole big controversial thing, which they're still saying even now, where, back in the 80s and 90s, they, quote-unquote, emptied the state hospitals, and all the, psychiatric patients were out on the street and causing problems on the street. And, yeah, I mean, the idea was valid and good even, to have community treatment, basically, to get people out of the hospitals and into the community and provide the treatment in the community. But, that was easier said than done. So, I mean, I think now there's a whole new light on it, which is how the police are involved with mental health patients that are in the streets. And I think it's going to start the pendulum's going to start swinging the other way again, which is that the police have been relied upon much too much, and they don't know they're not trained in dealing with people who are psychotic. So it's a really complex issue, because, in a way it's really like black and white, in a lot of cases there's black and white, and there also is gray, to some extent. And the police come in and they'll see black and white. They'll see somebody who's acting, quote unquote, crazy. So they'll intervene in whatever way they know, which is not appropriate.
Well, one of the things that has been discussed is the fact that when all of the various drugs came out and they did help people, and they started releasing people from the hospitals, it really became up to that individual to continue on their medication. Because if they went off their medication, they could go right back to where they were. In some cases, worse off. We've seen a large uptick in homeless people in this country.
Yes.
And many of them who are living on the streets do suffer from mental illness of one sort or another. I mean, not all. Some people are just down on their luck, but there are a good deal of mentally ill people on the streets. And
that's true.
How do you, like you said about the pendulum swinging back, I mean, if these people can't be responsible to take their medication, somebody is going to need to give it to them in a supervised environment, right?
Yes. However, I mean, here in New York, that was addressed. There was a whole movement of having what they called case managers, which was one person to a patient, and they were supposedly going to follow that patient for life, and that was part of the thinking of that, was that the patient who was, recently let out of the hospital needed to have somebody supervising them.
Right, supervision.
Yeah, exactly. But, that had its own shortcomings. So, it worked to an extent. And one of the really fascinating parts of all that is that one of the reasons that people stop taking their medication, and I heard this so many times, and there's a certain logic to it, if it worked, they would say, well, I'm okay now, so what do I need medication for? And they would stop.
Well,
but,
okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? But the whole idea was, it's like a catch-22. The whole idea was that they're well because they're taking the medication. And the thing is that this is a big part of it too, is that a lot of the medications do have like horrendous side effects. And I don't know if there's been any writing on it recently, but a lot of these patients die young because, I mean, a lot of it had to do with their circumstances, of course, and, not leading healthy lifestyles, but a lot of it also had to do with the effects of these medications on their bodies.
Like they were really damaging to the liver or the kidneys or something like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And diabetes, a lot of them would cause diabetes. They would cause large weight gains, even if they didn't overeat. And a lot of them, the drugs cause people to really have a need to smoke. So they would chain smoke. I mean, it's just a really bad scene all around,
So while the drugs were helpful for a lot of people, they weren't a cure-all, basically.
No, absolutely not. Mm-mm.
Well, interesting. We'll see how that plays out. Let me transition this over to your book. We just have a few minutes left. So your book is called 30 Years Hence. Tell us a little about the book. What is it about?
Okay, 30 Years Hence is a book that the story takes place in New York City, mainly Manhattan and Queens, in the early to mid-1970s. The title, 30 Years Hence, refers to it being 30 years after World War II and the Holocaust. The two main characters are two women, one of whom is Ida, and she's in her mid-40s, and she's a Holocaust survivor, and she lives in Queens. The other woman is Michelle, and she's in her early 20s, just starting out on her own, and they meet. And they find that despite their different backgrounds and their different ages, what they share in common is a sort of depression, if you will, and an emotional malaise that they relate to in each other. And so they hit it off and they become friends. And then they have all kinds of different events or adventures, if you want to call it that. But all through the book, there are, I guess you could say, two of my main interests, which are psychology and the political. And I mean, it just occurred to me in a way that the two go hand in hand, really, because the political, you could say, is like psychology on a mass level, you know? It's like the psychology of a society. Anyway, so the book is about the things that they do and stuff that they go through, including drugs and sex and rock and roll and all that. And also it's the me generation, the 70s. And like I had somebody ask me the other day, you know, what is meant by the me generation? And really I think what it is that the 60s was a very social time. It was about social movements, and people were very social and you know, love and be with the one you're with and all that.
Right.
Right? And then coming into the 70s, it was sort of like, you know, I don't know if you want to say it evolved or devolved into, you know, people were sort of burnt out, and a lot of people had overindulged in the 60s. And so basically the 70s became a time of looking within oneself, and it became a time of programs and like Est. Did you ever hear of Est?
Yes, yeah. Is that the screaming one?
No.
Oh,
I mean, I think, they did do some screaming.
Right, scream therapy.
It wasn't really known as that.
Okay.
That, I think, was like rebirthing, to my knowledge. But anyway, so they were in the me generation, and part of what the book is about is this one of those kind of programs, and it's based on techniques that are kind of trying to mimic the Holocaust, which sounds weird, and it is kind of, but personally I think it would make a great film. Hint, hint, to anybody who might be listening. Seriously, it's like the Holocaust is recreated in of course, a small version of it, and less brutal, of course. Nobody gets killed and nobody's severely harmed, but the goal of it is to make people realize how good they have it. Well, basically, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say your reference between the 60s and the 70s. The 70s was like the hangover from the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And people were looking for a cure.
Yeah. Everybody had a headache.
You know? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, right, people weren't feeling all that great.
So I don't want to give a spoiler on the book, but what is... I'm still trying to put together the idea. Okay, so it's two women. They come from very different backgrounds, different ages. But how does that relate to the Holocaust, aside from one being a Holocaust survivor?
Well, Ida being a Holocaust survivor is important to the story, because Ida, how she is at her age, in 40-something, 30 years after she went through the hideousness of the Holocaust, nobody ever forgets that stuff. No matter how well people adjusted afterwards, those who managed to survive, their minds were filled with imagery and memories of stuff that, if you dream about it, which I'm sure all of them did, and whoever's left still does, even though now it's like 80 years later, it stays in your mind, and it stays with you, and it's really hellish. That's why all along the way there are, people who survived the Holocaust years later committed suicide. I mean, that stuff stays in your brain. So this woman, Ida, in the book, she's managed to lead an outwardly normal life. She had children. She has a husband who's also a survivor. And yet here she is, called like a midlife crisis. And when she meets Michelle, Michelle is one of these young people who's having like a hangover, as you put it.
Okay.
Although it's a little more severe than that for her, because she had, personal problems in her family that led her to being really depressed, which led to, escapism through drugs and all that. So anyway, she and Ida hit it off. And they also run into this man who's also a Holocaust survivor, and he has set up a business which is like a dial-a-prayer type business. Okay. And Michelle has a friend who works there, and et cetera, and they all meet each other, and Charles, who's the one who owns the business, sets up this program which uses the Holocaust as a quote-unquote model for the program. So that's how the Holocaust
okay. I think we'll leave it at that. We don't want to give away any more of the book. And we do have to wind this down. So thank you so much. The book is out now?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure. It's available, anywhere that you get books, you can get it.
Okay. And last question, do you have a website you want to give out?
Yes, sure. Basically, it's my name, Denise Beck-Clark.com.
Okay. And there's information on the book and about you and all that on the website,
Yes, and there's also, like I said, I've published several things on Medium if anybody's interested.
Okay. Well, Denise, thanks so much for coming on the show, and it was nice talking to you. Best of luck with your book. I hope it does well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.